You feel cold air on your skin. You reach for a jacket without thinking. It is automatic. It is invisible. You do not calculate it, you do not plan it, your hand simply finds the sleeve and your body settles into warmth a moment later. But this small, unconscious act carries the weight of one of the most important survival decisions your species ever made. For most of human history, your ancestors had no jacket, no woven fabric, no zippers, no buttons, no stitched seams. They had only their own skin and a thin layer of body hair, already far less dense than the fur of other primates. They were exposed in a way almost no other mammal on the planet is exposed. And then, at some point deep in the past, that changed forever. So when did humans actually start wearing clothes? The answer is stranger than you might expect, because there is no cave painting that records it. No artifact labeled first jacket. Instead, the evidence comes from something almost nobody would think to look at. Lice. Body lice are different from head lice. They are a separate, specialized species, and they cannot survive on bare skin. They need fabric, fibers, folds of cloth to cling to and lay their eggs in. This means body lice could not have existed before clothing did. The lice are, in a strange way, fossils of a behavior, even though they leave no bones behind. Researchers Ralph Kittler, Manfred Kaiser, and Mark Stoneking realized this in 2003. They studied the genetic divergence between human head lice and human body lice, essentially using the lice themselves as a biological clock, counting backward through generations of mutation to estimate when the two populations split apart. Their conclusion: clothing likely emerged somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. A second team reached a similar window using a different method. In 2011, researchers Melissa Toops, Andrew Kitchen, Jessica Light, and David Reed ran their own lice-based genetic analysis. They landed on a date close to 170,000 years ago, and placed the origin of clothing in Africa before humans began their major migrations out of the continent. Think about that for a moment. Clothing may be older than agriculture, older than writing, older than almost every technology you instinctively associate with civilization. It may be older than the journey that took your species across the entire planet. Before the pyramids, before the wheel, before language even reached the complexity it has today, someone was already wrapping something around their body to survive the night. Why then? Why not earlier and why not later? The leading explanation is brutally simple. The climate forced it. Anthropologist Ian Gilligan has spent years studying this exact question, and his research points to one dominant driver: cold. As early humans pushed into colder regions and endured glacial periods, bare skin stopped being a minor discomfort and became a liability that could kill within hours. Hypothermia does not care how clever you are. It does not care how strong you are, how good a hunter you are, or how well you can read animal tracks. It simply ends you quietly while you sleep, as your core temperature drops degree by degree. Gilligan's 2018 research goes further, tracing how clothing technology seems to track climate cycles almost perfectly across tens of thousands of years. When the world plunged into colder glacial phases, the archaeological evidence for more sophisticated, tailored clothing increases. When the climate warmed again, that evidence becomes less pronounced, less elaborate. Clothing, in this view, was not a fashion statement and it was not decoration first. It was thermal engineering, built from necessity, refined over tens of thousands of years of trial and error against the cold. The same way a tool gets sharper the more times it fails and gets reshaped. But knowing that humans wore something is different from knowing how they made it. For that, you need physical evidence. And that evidence does exist, buried in stone and bone. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, excavations led by archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood have uncovered bone tools and processed ochre dating back roughly 75,000 to 100,000 years. These are not random scraps. They are the kind of fine, deliberate hide-working tools needed to turn a raw, stiff animal pelt into something soft enough to wear against skin. Scraping, softening, shaping. None of it glamorous. All of it essential. Every one of those tools represents hours of repetitive, unglamorous labor that most people today will never think about, let alone perform. Now picture the scene. A small group huddled near a fire as a glacial wind cuts low across an open plain. Someone sits slightly apart from the others, working a stretched hide between their hands. They scrape away fat and tissue with a sharpened stone tool, over and over, the same motion repeated hundreds of times, until the material finally softens enough to bend without cracking. This is not a luxury craft. This is survival labor, as critical as hunting or finding water. A poorly prepared hide stiffens in the cold and cracks at the first hard fold. A well-prepared one bends, breathes, and holds in warmth through a freezing night. The difference between those two outcomes is the difference between waking up the next morning and not waking up at all. For tens of thousands of years, this is roughly where the technology stayed. Simple draped hides, wrapped around the body and tied or pinned in place. Functional but crude. Effective against wind, but full of gaps where cold air could slip in at the edges. Then something shifts. At Denisova Cave in Siberia, archaeologists have recovered bone needles, tools delicate and precise enough to pierce hide and pull thread or sinew through in a controlled, repeatable way. This is not draping anymore. This is sewing. A needle changes everything, because it allows clothing to be fitted, layered, and shaped to the exact contours of the body, rather than simply hung over it like a blanket. Loose hides let cold air leak in at every seam and gap. Fitted, sewn clothing seals those gaps closed. Think about how different this is. A draped hide can shift with every movement, exposing skin at the neck, the wrists, the ankles. A sewn garment stays in place. It traps a thin layer of warm air against the body and holds it there, hour after hour, even as the wearer walks, hunts, or sleeps. This single shift, from wrapping to stitching, likely meant the difference between surviving the edge of a glacier and being pushed back from it entirely. The clearest proof of just how advanced this sewing technology eventually became comes from the Sungur burial site in Russia, excavated by archaeologist Otto Bader. The graves there, roughly 30,000 to 34,000 years old, contain thousands of ivory beads. They are not scattered randomly across the burial. They are arranged in clear, repeating lines and patterns that match exactly where seams and garment edges would have run. Archaeologists reading these bead patterns have reconstructed what amounts to a sewn, fitted, multi-layered cold-weather outfit, complete with trousers, a tunic, and a hood. This is not a rough hide thrown over the shoulders. This is engineered clothing, built piece by piece, decades and centuries of accumulated knowledge passed down before agriculture, cities, or metal tools ever existed. Picture that burial as it would have looked in life, not death. A person dressed head to toe in fitted hide, every seam reinforced, every joint covered, thousands of small ivory beads catching the firelight as they move. This was not a person barely surviving the cold. This was a person who had mastered it. And clothing was not only about survival. At sites linked to the Upper Paleolithic, researchers Olga Soffer, James Adavajo, and David Hyland studied impressions left in clay and on carved Venus figurines dating to roughly 27,000 years ago. Woven textile patterns appear pressed into those impressions, evidence of basket weaving and early textile production layered into clothing and broader material culture. Clothing had become more than thermal insulation. Carried texture, carried pattern. It may have carried something closer to identity, signaling status, group, or skill to everyone who saw it. So picture the full arc of this story. A species without thick fur, slowly losing dense body hair over millions of years of evolution. A species that pushes north into brutal, unforgiving cold, with no biological defense waiting in reserve. And rather than evolving thicker hair the way other cold-adapted animals did, your ancestors solved the problem externally instead. They invented a portable environment they could wear on their own bodies. A second skin, made by hand, refined generation after generation. From a loosely draped hide to a tightly stitched, multi-layered garment marked with beadwork along every seam. Here is the counterintuitive twist. Clothing did not just protect humans from the cold. It may have been one of the technologies that allowed humans to outcompete other hominin species, including Neanderthals, who endured many of the same Ice Age conditions across the same landscapes. Some researchers argue that the gap in clothing sophistication, fitted and sewn versus loosely draped and wrapped, may have given certain populations a critical survival edge during the harshest glacial periods. A few extra degrees of retained body heat, sustained night after night, season after season, year after year, can be the difference between a group that survives a winter and a group that does not. Multiply that small advantage across thousands of winters, and it stops looking small at all. There is another layer to this story worth sitting with. Clothing did not appear once and then stay fixed. It evolved the way a tool evolves, shaped by failure as much as success. Early hides probably split at the shoulders during a hard winter, leaking warmth exactly where it mattered most. Someone noticed. Someone adjusted the cut, or doubled the layer, or learned to fold the seam a different way. None of this was written down. It was passed from hand to hand, from one generation watching another work a hide by firelight, the same way you might learn to tie a shoelace by watching rather than reading instructions. Knowledge moved through muscle memory and observation, not through books, and yet it accumulated just as surely. Consider how much trial and error must sit behind a single-eyed needle. Someone had to first imagine that thread could be pulled through a hole rather than simply wrapped and knotted around an edge. Someone had to drill that hole into bone, fine enough not to shatter the material, precise enough to let sinew pass through smoothly. That is not a single invention. That is dozens of small inventions stacked on top of each other, each one nearly invisible on its own, but together producing something that looks, in hindsight, almost effortless. And the climate did not just demand clothing once, kept demanding more. As glacial periods deepened and temperatures dropped further, the margin for error narrowed. A loosely wrapped hide might be enough during a mild cold snap. It was not enough during the depths of an ice age, when temperatures could sit far below freezing for months without relief. This is likely why the archaeological record shows clothing complexity rising in step with the harshest glacial periods. Exactly as Gilligan's research suggests. The environment was not a constant pressure. It was an escalating one, and human technology had to escalate alongside it, or the people wearing it simply did not survive to pass on what they knew. Now think about your own closet. The jacket you grabbed without thinking this morning. The layers you put on without calculating thermal conductivity, wind resistance, or insulation values. You are using, almost unconsciously, a technology your ancestors spent tens of thousands of years inventing, testing, and improving one needle stitch at a time, in conditions that would kill most people today within a single night. Every zipper you pull, every hood you raise against the wind, traces back to that same basic insight discovered in the cold, by people whose names are lost, whose only legacy is a scraped hide, a bone needle, and a pattern of beads marking exactly where a seam once was. You feel cold air on your skin, and you reach for a jacket without thinking. It is automatic. It is invisible. But it is also one of the oldest, most quietly brilliant inventions your species ever made, and you are still living inside its consequences every single day.